is something about a fire at night. It goes back further than memory, further than history. Something in the oldest part of the human brain responds to it. The warmth, the light, the way it holds back the dark just enough to make you feel safe. Our ancestors sat around fires like this one for thousands of years. They cooked beside them, they slept beside them, they told stories beside them, and the stories they told were not always comforting ones. Some stories were warnings, some stories were records, some were attempts to make sense of things that had been seen, heard, or felt just out there beyond the firelight, things that didn't have a good explanation and maybe still don't. Those are the stories I'm interested in. My name is Paul. Welcome to Voices from the Veil, a place where I sit with you beside the fire and read you the stories that people tell in low voices. The ones that come out of the dark forests and never quite went back in. The ones from the house at the end of the road. The ones from the stretch of highway where something was standing there that shouldn't have been standing there. These stories come from everywhere because the dark is everywhere. Tonight I have 3 stories for you. They were told to me as true, so find somewhere comfortable, turn the lights down if you haven't already, and listen close, because whatever is out there tonight, it's already listening to you. The letting in. I'll tell you exactly how my mother lost her mind. Not lost it in the way people say, not stress, not age, not the slow fog of dementia that takes people gently if you're lucky, and roughly if you're not. I mean lost it, the way you lose something that gets taken, deliberately, by something that wanted what was inside of her, and knew exactly how to get it out. I'm her daughter. I was there for all of it. I watched it happen over the course of 11 days in March, and I could not stop it. I have not slept a full night since, and it has been 6 years, and I have accepted that I will probably never sleep a full night again. This is what happened. We grew up in a hollow in Carter County, Tennessee. If you know the area, you know the kind of place I mean. A fold in the mountains where the ridge comes down on both sides and the hollow sits between them like something cupped in 2 hands. Narrow enough that in winter the sun only hits the floor of it for a few hours in the middle of the day. Our house had been in my mother's family for 4 generations. Old house, old land. The kind of place that has absorbed so much of our family's living that it stopped feeling like a structure and starts feeling like a member of the family itself. Every room had a memory in it. Every floorboard had a sound she knew by name. My mother knew that house the way she knew her own body. She would have known immediately if something was wrong with it. That's the part that I still can't get past. She knew. From the very first night she knew something was wrong, and she told me so, and I told her it was the wind and the old pipes and the way the hollow house settled in the cold weather. And she believed me, because she wanted to believe me, and because I was her daughter and she trusted me, and that trust is something I will carry for the rest of my life like a stone in the chest that never gets lighter. It starts with sounds. The first night, a Sunday, mid-March, cold snap that had come down hard off the ridge and dropped the temperature 20 degrees in the afternoon. She called me at just past midnight. I lived 40 minutes away. She said she was sorry to wake me, but there was something outside her house. Walking around it, she could hear footsteps in the frozen ground, slow and deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the house like something taking inventory. I asked if it could be an animal. She said no. She'd lived in those mountains her whole life, and she knew animal movement, and this was not animal movement. This was measured, patient, like something counting the walls. I told her to lock the doors and call me if it came closer, and I lay in bed telling myself it was deer. It was a neighbour's dog. It was the ice contracting in the ground at the base of the walls. I told myself all these things very firmly, and I went back to sleep. In the morning she called and said I had walked around the house for 3 hours before it stopped. She sat up and listened to it every minute of it. She said the worst part was not the sound, but the silence between each footstep. Too long. Whatever was walking was taking steps that were far too far apart for anything that moved the way living things move. I drove up that morning and walked the perimeter of the house with her. The ground was frozen solid, had been for days, hard enough to ring under your heel. Nothing should have been able to leave a mark in it. There were impressions in the ground, spaced too far apart. Not a clear footprint. The ground was too hard for that. But depressions, each one maybe a foot across, irregular shaped, pressed into the frozen soil at intervals that I paced out and tried to make sense of, and could not. I told her it was probably deer. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not afraid exactly. More like a person who just understood something they didn't want to understand. Who has had a door open in their mind and seen clearly what's behind it and knows the door can't be closed again now that it has been opened. She said, "It's not dear, baby." She said it quietly, the way you say something true. I didn't argue. I helped her check the locks and made sure every window was latched, and I drove home and told myself it was deer. The sound changed the third night. She called me at 2 a.m, and I could hear something in her voice that I had never heard there in my entire life. My mother was a strong woman, Carter County strong, mountain strong, the kind of woman who had buried a husband and raised 2 children alone in a hollow house and kept her chin up through all of it. Fear was not something she wore. She had no practice wearing it, and it showed. The fear in her voice was naked and unmanaged and raw, with no shell around it. She said it had found the window. Her bedroom window, ground floor, facing the hollow. She said she'd woken to the sound of breathing on the glass, not fogging it. She checked in the morning on the first night it happened, and there was no condensation, just the sound, close and slow and deliberate against the glass, an inch from her face, with only window beneath them. She said she hadn't moved. She'd lain there in the dark with that sound against the glass, and she'd kept her eyes closed and she'd prayed, which she hadn't done in 20 years, and after a long time, the breathing stopped. I drove up at 2:30 in the morning, pulled up the hollow road with my headlights on high, and got out of the car and stood in the cold and looked at the ground outside her bedroom window. The same depressions, deeper this time, and something else. The window glass had a mark on the outside, not a handprint, not anything I could put a name to. A smear that was too large to be a hand and too deliberate to be a random mark, spread across the lower half of the glass in a pattern that my eyes kept trying to find a shape in and failing. I slept on her couch that night. I heard nothing. In the morning over coffee, she told me something that she hadn't told me on the phone. She said when the breathing was on the glass, she had opened her eyes, just for a moment, just a fraction. She hadn't meant to. Her body had done it before she could stop it, the way the body betrays you. She had seen something on the other side of the glass. Not clearly. It was dark, and the glass had the mark on it, and her eyes had only been open for a fraction of a second before she squeezed them shut again. But she had seen enough to tell me that whatever was outside her window was tall, taller than the window frame, which was 6 feet off the ground, and that it was the wrong shape. Not wrong the way an unfamiliar animal is wrong the way something is wrong when it has tried to approximate a shape it has seen but doesn't fully understand, like a shape assembled from a description rather than from direct knowledge of the thing being described. She said it had a head. She could see that much. She said the head was tilting at an angle that heads don't tilt. She said she thought it was looking at her through its own reflection in the glass. I called my brother that morning. He lived in Elizabethton, and he came that afternoon, and the three of us sat at my mother's table and talked about it in a careful, practical way our family talks about the hard things, laying facts out like tools on a workbench and examining them one by one. My brother was skeptical. He made the case for an animal, for a person, for the way an isolated hollow at night can manufacture terrors from ordinary sounds. He made it well, and my mother listened and nodded and said nothing. After he finished, she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and she said, "I know what I saw, son." He said it in the same way she said, "It's not a deer, baby." Quiet, true, with the absolute and terrible certainty of someone who has moved past hope of a different explanation. My brother stayed 3 nights and heard nothing and saw nothing and drove home. I stayed through the end of the week. The breathing came back to the window every night. Every night I heard nothing from the couch. Every night my mother heard everything from her bed. On the seventh night, she stopped coming to tell me about it in the mornings. I noticed a change first in her eyes, not in anything she said or did. She was still herself in all the external ways, still made coffee in the morning, still asked about my job and my life, still moved through her house with the comfortable authority of a woman on her own ground, but her eyes were different. There was a quality in them that I couldn't name at first, and that I spent several days trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing. On the 8th day I named it, they were listening. Not to me, not to anything in the room. It had the quality of a person listening very carefully to a sound that only they could hear, a continuous sound, a sound that required constant attention. She would be talking to me, and in the middle of a sentence, her eyes would go to that place, that interior listening place, and the sentence would trail off, and she would sit there for a moment before coming back. I asked her what she was hearing. She looked at me for a long time, then she said, "It's been talking to me." I asked her what I was saying. She shook her head, not like she didn't know, like she decided not to tell me. That night I moved my things from the couch to the floor outside her bedroom door, and I lay there in the dark and I listened with everything I had. At 2 in the morning, the breathing started on the glass. I got up slowly and went to her bedroom door and put my hand on the handle. It was cold, not room cold, not even outside cold. The cold of something that generates no heat of its own, radiating out the door handle into my palm and up my wrist, and I let go and stepped back and stood in the hallway with my heart going and that cold still in my hand. I heard my mother's voice through the door. She was talking, quietly, too quietly for me to make words out, a murmur, continuous conversation, her voice and then the silence where another voice would be, her voice and then silence, back and forth, the rhythm of a conversation with someone who was answering her. I could not hear what was answering her. I could not hear anything that should have been answering. I put my hand on the door handle a second time. She stopped talking immediately. Absolute silence from the inside of the room. Then her voice louder, clear enough to hear through the door. She said, "Don't come in." Not frightened, not warning me away from danger. Firm, private, the voice of a person protecting a conversation they don't want interrupted. I stood in that hallway until dawn. She didn't speak again. In the morning she came out and made coffee and looked at me with those listening eyes, said good morning the way she always did, and didn't mention any of it. On the 10th night, I broke her door down. I'm not proud of how long it took me. I've asked myself every day since why I didn't do it sooner, why I stood in that hallway and that couch for 9 nights and told myself there was an explanation. And the only honest answer I have is that there was something in the air of that house by the end that made it very hard to make decisions. A heaviness, a quality of pressure like the air had thickened. Like thinking clearly required more effort than it should. Like the part of my brain that raises alarms had been slowly and deliberately turned down. On the 10th night, I heard my mother's voice through the door, and something in it was gone. Something fundamental. Some quality that had been in her voice my entire life that I hadn't had a name for. Because you don't name the things that have always been there. And now it was absent, and its absence had a name immediately. And the name was wrong, and I put my shoulder onto that door and I went through it. It was dark, cold. Not the handle cold, not the absent cold, but a deep and total cold. I had no business being in a closed room, and that hit me like a wall when I came through the door. My mother was sitting up in the bed, facing the window, her back to me. The window was open. It was March in Carter County, a hollow at 2 in the morning, and the window was fully open and the curtains were moving in a wind I could feel from the doorway, cold and steady and smelling of something I cannot describe, except to say it was the smell of the deep woods at night, of soil and cold water, and something underneath both of those that had no name I knew. I turned the light on. My mother turned back to look at me, and I saw her face. I want to be careful here about what I tell you, because some of what I saw I have spent 6 years trying to find clinical explanations for, and some of those explanations have been partly satisfying, and some have not been satisfying at all. Her face was wrong. Her face was her face, every feature exactly where it had always been, but the expression on it was not an expression I had ever seen on a human face, not any human face. It was an expression that didn't belong to the vocabulary of human emotion, and something that existed outside that vocabulary entirely. Something that was using her face as a surface to appear on the way a face appears in the grain of wood if you look long enough. Present, but not native. There, but not there. She looked at me. The thing using her face looked at me, and it smiled. Her smile. Exactly her smile. But behind it, something that had never been behind any smile she had ever given in her entire life. Something vast and cold, so utterly without the quality of caring about anything human that I felt like a physical force, like standing too close to something enormous. Then it spoke. Her voice, her exact voice. It said, "You should have come sooner." She was hospitalized that night. I called 911 and told them my mother was having a psychotic episode because I did not have language for what was actually happening. That would not result in both of us being hospitalized. She was in a facility in Johnson City for 3 months. When she came home, she was medicated and quieter, and mostly herself. Mostly the woman I knew, with those listening eyes still present but dimmer, turned down the way you turn down something you don't want to hear. She never talked about those 11 days. I tried once, carefully, and she looked at me with an expression so exhausted and so final that I stopped, and I have not tried again. She still lives in the hollow, in the house. She wouldn't leave it, wouldn't hear of leaving it, and I've come to understand that as its own kind of answer, its own testimony to something I can't fully interpret. She keeps the windows locked now, every window, every night, latched and checked before dark. I've watched her do it, methodically, though moving from window to window in early evening like a ritual, like something she does not skip, regardless of weather or season. I asked her once why she checks them herself every night instead of just leaving them locked. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Because it knows how to ask to be let in. It learned how from me." She paused, and it learned my voice well enough that if it asked me in my voice, you might not know the difference. She looked at me, so I checked them myself. So you know it's me who checked them. So there's one thing in this house it can't use against us. She went back to her chair and picked up her book, and that was the end of the conversation. I drive up to that hollow every week. I check the windows with her every evening before dark, moving from room to room in early dusk, the two of us together, latching and checking and saying nothing. I don't know what came to the house in March 6 years ago. I don't know what it wanted, or what it took, or how much of my mother came back from that facility, and how much of something else came back wearing her correctly. I check the windows. I watch her face in unguarded moments for that expression, the vast cold thing behind her eyes. Most days I don't see it. Most days she is entirely herself, warm and practical and mountain strong, making coffee and asking about my life. Her voice exactly the voice I have known my entire life, most days. But some evening, when the light goes down and the hollow gets dark fast the way it does when the ridge cuts off the last of the sun, she goes quiet in the middle of a sentence, and her eyes will go to the listening place, and I'll watch her, and I'll wait, and after a moment she'll come back and smile at me and say, "Where was I?" And I'll tell her, and she'll pick up the thread and we'll go on, and I'll tell myself it's fine, and I'll tell myself she's fine, and I'll go home when it's full dark, and I'll lie in my bed, and I'll stare at the ceiling, and I'll hear her voice in my head, her voice exactly saying the thing it said to me through her mouth on the 10th night. "You should have come sooner." And I'll wonder, was that my mother warning me? Or was it that thing inside her telling me I'd already lost? 6 years later, I still don't know. 6 years later, I'm not sure the difference matters anymore. And that is the most frightening thing of all. 6 years. 6 years of checking windows, 6 years of watching her mother's face in unguarded moments for something that has no name, 6 years of lying awake hearing a voice that was her mother's voice, saying words her mother may or may not have said. You should have come in sooner. I've thought about that line more than I've thought about almost anything else since I first heard this story, because there are two ways to hear it, and both of them are terrible. Either her mother was in there, something aware enough to warn her daughter that she'd waited too long, or the thing wearing her mother's face had already won and was telling her so. 6 years later, she still doesn't know which one it is. I'm not sure I want to know either. What I do know is this. Whatever came to that hollow in Carter County, Tennessee, whatever stood outside that window in the dark and learned and waited and found its way inside, it didn't come in through the window. It didn't break the glass. It didn't force anything. It was let in. And that was the most unsettling truth at the centre of this story. Not the breathing on the glass, not the cold in the door handle, not the expression that didn't belong on a human face. The fact that something that patient, something that deliberate, something that understood exactly how to get inside the one person it had chosen, needed permission to do it. And eventually, it found a way to ask. If this story sat with you the way it sat with me, stay where you are, don't go anywhere, because I have another story for you tonight. And I promise you, it's worse. It comes from Ashe County, North Carolina, a farmhouse at the end of a gravel road, an old woman who left her porch light on every single night for 11 years, and something that stood at the end of that road in the dark and learned what the light meant. Porch light. My grandmother left the porch light on every night of her life, not for security, not from fear of the dark. She left it on for my grandfather, who had been dead for 11 years by the time any of this happened, because she said he always came home late and she didn't want him walking into a dark house. My mother used to say it gently, the way you'd address something that isn't hurting anyone. Mama, he's been gone 11 years. And my grandmother would say, I know, and then leave the light on anyway. It was the kind of devotion that had moved past grief and into something quieter and more permanent, a habit of love that didn't know how to stop. We accepted it. You accept the things that come from that kind of love. The porch light was on every night, until the night my grandmother turned it off herself and nailed the front door shut from the inside and sat in the dark in the middle of the living room floor and would not move and would not speak until my mother arrived at 7 in the morning and found her there. That was the beginning. Or rather, that was the night my grandmother finally understood what had been going on for weeks without her realising it. I'll explain. My grandmother's house sat at the end of a gravel road in Ashe County, North Carolina, about a mile off the state highway, surrounded on 3 sides by old-growth timber that came down close to the yard and stopped at the tree line like it was observing a border. She had lived there for 53 years. She knew that property the way she knew her own face. She knew which trees the owls preferred and where the fox denned at the edge of the east pasture, and exactly how long it took headlights to appear on the gravel road from the moment you turned off the highway. She was not a woman who startled easily. She was not a woman who called my mother over for nothing. She called my mother the first time on a Tuesday in late September. She said there was someone on the road. Not on the highway, on the gravel road that led only to her house, standing at the far end of it all, at the tree line where the road met the highway, in the dark, visible from her porch because the porch light caught the edge of them, a shape, human-sized, standing still. She'd seen it when she went out to check the mail she'd forgotten to bring in, which she did every night before bed, and when she looked up the road, there it was, standing at the far end and looking towards the house. She stood on her porch and looked at it, and it looked at her for a long moment. Then she went inside and called my mother, and by the time my mother talked her into going back out to look with the phone she still had in her hand, it was gone. My mother told her it was probably a neighbour out for an evening walk. My grandmother said no neighbour of hers walks the road at that hour and stood at the end of it, staring at her house. My mother said it could have been a hunter, a lost hiker, any number of things. My grandmother said maybe, and went to bed and didn't call her again for 9 days. When she called her again, she said it was back. Same place, same time, just after 10 at night, when she went for the mail. standing at the far end of the road at the tree line, perfectly still, looking towards the house. This time it was there for longer before she went inside. She said she stood on her porch and watched for several minutes, trying to make out details. And she couldn't. Just a shape, human proportions, but something not quite right about the proportions, something she couldn't specify. Just a nagging wrongness about the relationship between the parts. Like the height was right, but the width was wrong. Or the width was right, but the way the weight was distributed was wrong. She said it never moved while she watched it. She said it felt like it was waiting for something. My mother drove up the next morning and walked the road to the tree line and found nothing. No footprints in the soft gravel at the road's edge where the drainage ditch collected moisture and kept the ground soft. Nothing distributed at the tree line. Nothing. My mother told my grandmother it was her eyes playing tricks in the dark and the distance. My grandmother looked at her with a steadiness that my mother described to me later as the look of someone who has decided not to argue about something they knew with certainty. She said, "It'll come closer." It came closer. Not all at once. Gradually over the following 2 weeks, the shape moved up the road towards the house. Not each night. Sometimes it wasn't there at all, and my grandmother would go out for the mail and come back in and not call anyone and not say anything. But when it was there, it was closer than the times before. 50 yards up the road, then 30, then at the edge of the light thrown by the porch lamp, which was as far as the light reached, standing at the exact border of light and the dark as though it understood the boundary and was making a point of standing precisely on it. My grandmother stopped going out for the mail at night. She had my mother set up a small table just inside the front door where she left her keys and her phone and her mail when she brought it in during the day, so she would never have a reason to go out after dark. She did this practically and without drama, the way she did everything, rearranging her habits around the new reality with the efficiency of a woman who had survived a great deal and knew how to adapt. She didn't tell my mother why she'd moved the table. My mother noticed and asked, and my grandmother said she just decided she preferred it there, and my mother let it go. What my grandmother didn't tell anyone, what she didn't tell us until the night she nailed the door shut and we finally got the whole story out of her in pieces over several weeks, was that by this point, it had stopped being something she only saw. It started being something she only heard. The sound started small, a step on the porch at night. Once, the particular sound of an old board taking weight, which she knew intimately. Her porch had 7 boards and each one had its own voice, and she knew them all. One step on the third board, which was the one closest to the door, and then nothing. She told herself it was an animal. She had a long history of raccoons on that porch, had lost a bird feeder to them twice, and she had the particular mountain woman's instinct to default to the simplest explanation. She went to the door and turned on the porch light from the inside and looked through the window and saw nothing on the porch, and told herself, "Raccoon," and went back to the chair. The following night, the same step, same board, then 2 steps, the third board, and the second, moving towards the door, then silence. She went through this every night for a week, always after 10, always the same boards in the same order, 1 more step added each time, moving towards the door, 1 footfall per night, with a patience and deliberateness that she said later reminded her of something counting, something methodical, something that understood the distance between where it was and where it wanted to be was the problem that could be solved 1 step at a time, and it had all the time in the world to solve it. On the 7th night, the steps reached the door. She heard the weight come onto the board directly in front of the door. The first board, the one that gave a particular low creak she'd been meaning to fix for 20 years. And then the silence. And then the sound she had described to us in the months since in several different ways, none of which have felt adequate to her. A pressure, she said, against the door. Not a knock, not a scratch, a pressure, as though something were leaning against it, as though something were resting its weight against the door in the casual way a person leans against a wall while they're waiting, comfortable, unhurried, sure of their eventual welcome. She sat in her chair 20 feet from the door and did not move and did not breathe and waited. After a long time, she thought perhaps 20 minutes, the pressure stopped. The first board creaked as the weight came off it. Steps across the porch retreating. Then nothing. She called no one. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the shape at the end of the road and the way it moved closer one increment at a time, and she thought about the steps on the porch moving towards the door, one night at a time, and she understood that she was watching something walk through a problem in stages, something that had a destination in mind and was finding its way there systematically. She thought about what that destination was. She thought about what was on the other side of that door. She did not sleep. The night she nailed the door shut, she called my mother at 2 a.m. My mother said she could barely understand her, which was the most frightening part to her, because my grandmother was a woman of clear, precise speech who had never in her life been difficult to understand. She was saying something about the light, about the porch light. My mother got the words, "Turn it off, and it thinks, and he's not coming." And then my grandmother's voice dropped below what the phone could carry, and my mother was in her car before she was fully dressed. She arrived at 7, the sun was up, the gravel road was empty, and the tree line was just a tree line, and the porch looked like it had always had, except for the nails, 6 of them, driven through the door frame, into the door itself, amateur and forceful. The kind of nailing job you do in the dark when you're frightened, and not the kind my grandmother, who had kept a precise and well-maintained house for 53 years, would ever have done under any other circumstance. My grandmother was on the floor in the middle of the living room, sitting upright, knees to her chest, facing the front door, fully dressed, including her coat and her shoes. The porch light was off for the first time in 11 years. She was not hurt. She was not in any medical crisis. She was not, as far as any doctor who saw her in the following weeks could determine, suffering from any neurological or psychiatric condition. She was a frightened woman who had been sitting on her floor in the dark for 5 hours and who took my mother's hand when she had come through the back door and held them hard and said, "I almost let it in." She told us the rest in pieces over weeks of Sunday dinners and careful questions, and the gradual way truth comes out of a person who has been holding it in tightly. She told us that on the night she nailed the door, she had been sitting in her chair at just past 10 when the steps came onto the porch, as they had every night. 3rd board, 2nd board, 1st board, the low creak of the one she'd been meaning to fix, the familiar sequence that had stopped frightening her in the way new things frighten you, and had settled into a dread that was almost routine, the way chronic pain becomes the background of living rather than event. But this time, there was no pressure against the door. This time, there was a knock. 3 knocks, measured and clear. The knock of someone who has every right to be at your door at 10 at night and knows it. She said her body was halfway out of the chair before her mind caught up with it. 53 years of answering that door, of opening it to neighbours and family and ordinary traffic of a life lived in one place for a very long time. 53 years of a porch light left on and a door opened to whoever was outside. 53 years of habit rose up in her and had her halfway to the door before she stopped herself. She stopped because of the porch light. He said what stopped her was a thought about the porch light, a thought that arrived with sudden and total clarity in the moment her body was moving towards the door. It's been watching the light for weeks. It's been standing at the end of the road, looking at the light. It knows what the light means. It knows the light means, "Come home." She sat back down. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, measured, patient, from the other side of the door 20 feet away. She said, and this is the part that she took the longest to tell us, the part she said in the lowest voice, the part she said only once and has never repeated. She said the knock was familiar, not like a stranger's knock, like a knock she knew, like the knock of someone who had stood on that porch 10,000 times over 53 years and knocked in a particular way that was their way, a habit of knocking as specific and recognizable as a voice or face. She said it was her husband's knock. 11 years dead, his knock, exactly on the other side of that door. She sat in her chair and she gripped the arms of it, and the knocking came again. 3 times, patient and familiar and exactly right, and she said the the part she can barely speak, is that for a moment, just a moment, just a splinter of a moment, she wanted to open the door. 53 years, a porch light on for 11 years, a woman who had never stopped waiting, and had found the one thing that could open the door, and it used it. She said she got up and went into the kitchen, got the hammer and nails, and she nailed that door shut in the dark, and she turned off the porch light because she understood in that moment with complete and terrible clarity that the light was an invitation, and had been an invitation for 11 years, and something had finally decided to accept it. And then she sat on the floor, she held her knees, and she waited for the morning, and she did not answer when the knock came a fourth time and a fifth time, and she did not answer when it stopped knocking and went back to silence, and she did not answer when the silence went on for hours, and she did not answer when the first birds started and the dark started going grey at the windows. She sat and she held on, and she did not open that door. My grandmother still lives in that house. She is 81 years old, and she is not going anywhere, and we have stopped asking her to. The porch light has not been turned on in 3 years. She had an electrician remove the bulb. The front door has a new frame now. My uncle replaced it the summer after it happened, taking the old nailed one off its hinges and putting it in a solid one with a deadbolt that she keeps locked at all hours, day and night. A habit as fixed and unchallenged as the old one of keeping the porch light used to be. She seems mostly like herself, sharp and dry and practical, the grandmother I have known my whole life. She tends her garden in the mornings and watches her programs in the evenings, and has strong opinions about the way the rest of the family does things, and is not shy about sharing them. But she doesn't sit in her chair by the front window anymore. She moved it to the back of the room, facing away from the door, and when I asked her why, she said she preferred the view. And some evenings, when we're all there for Sunday dinner, and the dark comes down, and the gravel road disappears into the night outside the window, she'll go quiet in the middle of a conversation and tilt her head slightly, the way a person tilts their head when they're listening for something at the edge of hearing. And then she'll come back and smile and pick up the thread, and I watch the door, and I think about 11 years of a porch light burning in the dark, and I think about what found it eventually, and I think about patience, the particular terrible patience of something that has no reason to hurry because it understands that time is not a problem for it the way it is a problem for us. And I think my grandmother, halfway out of her chair, 53 years of habit, one familiar knock, how close she came, how easily it almost worked. That was the porch light. Take a breath if you need it. The next story comes from deep in the mountains of West Virginia, a mining town that hasn't been a town for 40 years, a place where the ground was hollowed out so completely over so many decades that eventually the hollow found its way back up. People who have been to that place say the ground sounds different when you walk on it, not hollow exactly, more like occupied, more like something is listening from below. This story is called What Lives in the Low Places. What lives in low places? I want to tell you about Cutter's Drift, West Virginia, because almost nobody knows it existed, and the people who do know don't talk about it, and I think that silence is its own kind of testimony. Cutter's Drift was a coal town, not a large one. At its peak in the 1940s, it had maybe 400 people, a company store, a church, a school, 24 streets of identical company housing climbing the hillside above the mine entrance, the way coal town houses always did, stacked up the slope like they were trying to get as far away from the ground as possible, which if you knew what was under the ground, seems less like coincidence and more like instinct. The mine was called Cutter Seam, after the family that sank the first shaft in 1887. By the time the town was at its fullest, the Cutter operation had put down 11 shafts over a stretch of about 2 miles, pulling coal out of the mountain in a network of tunnels that ran so deep and so wide and so interconnected that the company's own engineers, in a report filed in 1951 that I found in the State Archives in Charleston, after 3 days of looking, described the subsurface structure beneath Cutter's Drift as, and I'm going to read you the exact words because they stayed with me since I found them, so thoroughly evacuated of material as to render the structure integrity of the surface layer a matter of serious ongoing concern. So thoroughly evacuated of material. They had hollowed out the mountain so completely over 60 years of pulling coal from it that the ground the town sat on was essentially a ceiling. 400 people living on a ceiling over an enormous, hollow, dark. The mine closed in 1961, not because the coal ran out, there was coal left, plenty of it, but because of what the miners started reporting in the deep tunnels. What they said they heard down there, in the sections that went deepest, in the places where the seam ran thin and the rock came close on all sides, and the dark was the kind of dark that has weight in it. The company's official reason for closing was economic. Falling coal prices, aging infrastructure, the usual. But I've spoken to two men whose fathers worked that mine in its final years, and both of them told me the same thing without knowing the other had said it. They said the miners stopped going into the deep sections about 6 months before the official closure. Just stopped, refused. Men who had spent their whole working lives underground. Men who had never once in 30 years of mining expressed anything resembling fear of the dark or the deep, simply would not go into those tunnels anymore. And when they asked why, when the foreman and the company men pushed for a reason, they said the same thing every time. Something was already down there, and it had started coming up. I first heard about Cutter's Drift from my father, who grew up in the McDowell County and had the McDowell County natives' encyclopedial knowledge of every mining disaster and ghost story and piece of buried history in the southern coal fields. He mentioned it the way you mention things you've always known, casually, in the middle of a longer conversation about something else, and the details he mentioned was this. He said when they closed the mine and the company pulled out and the town slowly emptied over the following decades as the jobs disappeared, some of the families stayed. Not many, maybe 30, 40 people by the late 1960s. Most older residents who had nowhere else to go or who simply could not imagine going. They stayed in the company houses on the hillside, and they kept their gardens, and they watched their town empty around them, and they lived, by all accounts, a quiet and diminished life, in a place that was becoming a memory where they were still in it. After then, in 1973, the last of them left, all at once, within the space of about 3 weeks. Every remaining resident of Cutter's Drift packed what they could carry and left, and not one of them went to the same place. They scattered. Different counties, different states. My father said he tried as a young man to track down some of these people, driven by the same curiosity that drives people towards things they've been told not to ask about, and of the 4 he'd managed to find and speak to, none of them would talk about why they'd left. Not in any specific way, because it was time, they said. They left because there was nothing left to stay for. One of them, an old woman in her 80s by the time my father found her, living in a ground floor apartment in Bluefield, with every blind in the place pulled down against the daylight, said one thing that she would not elaborate on. She said, the ground started sounding different, and we knew it was time. My father asked her what she meant by sounding different. She pulled her cardigan tighter and looked at the cupboard window and said, hollow sounds hollow. That's what it is. But this was something else. This was hollow, that had something in it. She wouldn't say anything else. My father never forgot it. Neither did I. Years later, when he passed it on to me, the way you pass on things that don't have anywhere else to go. I went to Cutter's Drift in the October of 2014. I want to be clear that I was a curious person, not as an investigator or researcher or anyone with any particular qualification to be there. I went because I had my father's story and the archive report and the particular pull that abandoned places exert on a certain kinds of people. And I went alone because the friend I'd planned to go with cancelled, and I decided to go anyway, which was a decision I've had occasion to reconsider many times since. There's no road to Cutter's Drift anymore. There was a company road once, but it's been 40 years and the mountains in that part of West Virginia take roads back fast. I parked at the Fire Road gate about 2 miles out and walked in through the second growth timber on what had once been the main access road and was now a depression in the forest floor, a seam of cleared ground that the trees hadn't quite finished reclaiming. It was mid-morning when I arrived at what had been the edge of town. The houses were still there, not all of them. Some had collapsed into themselves, roofs down, walls splayed outwards, the slow catastrophe of an abandoned structure left to weather for 40 years. But some were standing, not intact, not livable, but upright, holding a shape, company houses, identical, the particular grim functionality of coal company architecture, standing in their rows on the hillside, with their empty windows and their sagged porches and the trees growing up through some of the floors. I want to tell you about the silence. I've been in a lot of abandoned places over the years, drawn to them, the way I said, and they all have a quality of silence that is different from ordinary silence. The silence of a place that used to have people in it that doesn't anymore. A kind of acoustic absence, a frequency that should be there and isn't. Cutter's Drift had that silence, but underneath it was something else. It took me about 20 minutes of walking through the town before I consciously registered it, though I think some part of me had been receiving it since I arrived and had been trying to keep it below the threshold of awareness, because registering it fully meant dealing with what it was. The ground was making a sound. Not loud, not even quite a sound in the normal sense, more of a transmission, something you receive through the soles of your feet as much as through your ears, a low and continuous vibration that was just at the edge of perception. There and then, not there, and then there again, like a signal coming in and out. If I stood still on the patch of ground and concentrated, I could feel it through my boots, a resonance, a frequency, coming from below. I told myself it was settling, old mine tunnels, 60 years of slow collapse, the mountain rearranging itself around the voids left by extracted coal, a perfectly reasonable geological explanation. I told myself this, and I walked on, and I took photographs of the houses and the collapsed churches and the remains of the company store, and I told myself the feeling underfoot was geology and not anything else. Then I found a shaft. Not one of the main shafts. Those had been capped when the mine collapsed. Concrete caps sunk into the ground, regulation required. This was a smaller opening, a ventilation shaft or an access shaft from one of the secondary workings, set into the hillside at the edge of town, where the slope steeped. The cap on the one had failed, whether it had been inadequate from the start or had simply deteriorated over 60 years, I couldn't tell, but a section of it had collapsed inwards, leaving an opening, maybe 3 feet across, a black circle in the hillside with a rusted iron grate half fallen across it. I shouldn't have gone near it. I was aware of that. I was aware of it at any time. Every sensible instinct I had was pointing me away from it, and I went towards it anyway, because I am apparently the kind of person who does that, and because the pull of it was difficult to describe, except to say it felt less like curiosity and more like gravity, like the opening had drawn it to me, that opened on something below the level of decision. I crouched down about 4 feet from the opening, and I looked in. Dark. That particular absolute dark of an underground space. Dark that has never had light in it and has no relationship with light. A dark that feels structural rather than visual, like it would resist a torch rather than simply yield to it. And from that dark, the vibration was stronger, much stronger, not through my feet now, but directly coming out of the opening like a breath, a low, continuous resonance that I felt in my chest cavity, in my back teeth, in the bones of my face, and the underneath, the vibration, a sound. I've spent 9 years trying to find adequate language for this sound, and I haven't found it. The closest I get to it is this. Imagine the sound of movement in a very large space, the displacement of air that comes with something large moving through it, a large space, not loud, the opposite of loud, a sound that seems to be actively avoiding loudness, that seemed aware of itself and aware of being listened, for it was keeping itself just below the threshold of identifiable noise, a sound like something very large, moving very slowly through the dark below me, moving in a direction, moving upwards. I stood up. I stepped back from the opening. I stood there in the middle of Cutter's Drift on the hillside above the failed shaft cap, and I felt the vibration through my boots, and I heard the sound from below. And I looked out over the empty rooftops of the empty town, and I understood with a totality that bypassed argument entirely why 40 people had left this place in 3 weeks in 1973 without coordinating and without explanation and without ever coming back. The ground had started sounding different, and I had known what that meant. I left quickly, not running. I want to be precise about that, because it matters to me. I walked fast, and I did not look back. I did not stop until I reached my car at the Fire Road gate and got in and locked the doors and sat there for a while with the engine running. On the walk, I had noticed something I hadn't on the way in. The 2-mile stretch of old company road back to the gate, the depression in the forest floor, the seam of cleared ground. The trees on either side of it were wrong. Not all of them. Just the ones closest to the road, the ones where roots would have extended under the road's surface, under the cleared ground, down into whatever was below. The trees were dead, not recently dead, long dead, years dead, standing grey and barkless, with no understory growth around their base, which in that part of West Virginia in October should have been thick with fern and brush. Nothing around the base of these trees, just bare soil, packed hard and grey. The debt ran in a line along the road for most of its length. Whatever was below the ground of Cutter's Drift, whatever had been working its way up through 60 years of abandoned mine tunnels, had followed the road out, had come further than the town, was still coming. I don't know how far it has gotten in the 9 years since I walked that road. I don't know what it is. I have theories. Things built from equal parts geology and folklore, and the accounts of miners who refused to go into the deep sectors, and the old women in Bluefield with their blinds pulled down against the daylight. I have theories, and none of them are comforting. What I know is this: coal towns hollowed out the mountains from below, pulled the materials out, and left the dark in its place. Miles and miles of dark running under the hills of southern West Virginia, sealed up and capped and left. And the assumption that the companies made and the government made and that everyone made was that sealing it up meant it was dealt with, meant whatever was down there stayed down there. But here's what I've thought about in the 9 years since I crouched beside that failed shaft capped and listened. You can cap a mine. You can cap the shafts, you can pour concrete around the openings and walk away and write the economic report and call it closed. But you can't fill the dark back in. The dark is still there. All of it. Miles of it. Running under the hill, running under the towns built over the hills, running under the roads and the houses and the churches and the graves. All that removed material, all that extracted coal, all those decades of taking things out of the mountain and leaving nothing but space behind. And space in those old mountains is not empty. Space in these mountains is an invitation. And something down in the lowest and deepest and darkest of those spaces, in the places where the seam ran thin and the old miners stopped going down and refused to say exactly why, something accepted it. Something made itself at home in the dark. And it has been coming up ever since. Slow, patient, the way things move when time is not a problem for them. Following the tunnels upward, following the shafts towards the surface, following the roots of dead trees along the old company roads. Coming up, getting closer. One increment at a time. And somewhere in McDowell County, West Virginia, in a stretch of second growth timber off a fire road that most maps don't bother naming, there is a circle of failed concrete in a hillside with a rustic grate half fallen across it. And if you put your ear to it, if you're foolish enough to put your ear to it, I think you would hear it. Still moving, still rising, still finding its way through 60 years of dark towards the surface and the light and the world of the living above. Getting closer every year, getting closer every day. And one morning, In a town built over ground that sounds hollow when you walk on it, something is going to feel it coming up through the floor, and by then, it will be far too late to leave. Tonight, we sat through 3 stories. A woman whose mother was hollowed out from the inside by something that learned her face and her voice and found a crack in the door it needed. An old woman alone in a farmhouse who left a light on for someone who was never coming home, and something that found that light in the dark and learned what it meant and knocked with a dead man's hand. And a mountain in West Virginia with 60 years of dark inside it, and something in that dark that has been rising towards us ever since. 3 stories, 3 different fears, but the same truth underneath all of them, the same thing these mountains have always known and have always tried in their way to tell us, that the dark is not empty, that it has never been empty, that whatever lives in it has been here longer than we have, and will be here long after we're gone, and that the only thing standing between us and it is paying attention. If these stories found you at the right moment, if you're sitting somewhere a little less comfortable than you were an hour ago, checking the locks, listening to the sound your house makes at night with slightly more attention than usual, then they did what they were supposed to do. That's not cruelty. It's the oldest purpose of a story told in the dark, to remind you to pay attention, to remind you what's out there, to remind you that the world is larger and older and stranger than the lit and comfortable parts of it would have you believe. My name is Paul. This has been Voices from the Veil. I'll be back in a few days with a new fire and a new story. Something is waiting to be told, and I intend to tell it. Until then, check your windows, listen to the sounds your floor makes, and if the ground beneath your feet starts to feel different,